Hey everybody, it's Ashley Murtha, and this is my video presentation of my comprehensive paper for ATHS 697 Directive Comprehensive Studies at California State University, Northridge. Today I'm going to be talking about assistive technology relating to the least restrictive environment and free and appropriate public education. So the overview of my presentation, first I'm going to define some key terms. Next, I'm going to briefly describe the program learning outcomes, and then I'll go into further detail, synthesizing the research articles I found with AT intervention and support. And finally, I'm going to offer my conclusion and access to my references. So let's get into some of these key terms. What is assistive technology? Assistive technology is any item that is used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of a child with a disability. So some examples I have here of AT include augmentative alternative communication, a screen reading software, pencil grips, wheelchairs, dictation software. And then I have this really cool graphic on the right here with some buzzwords about assistive technology, such as tools, customized, innovative, working, and empowerment, which is one of my favorites because I think that it really drives home the idea that the goal of assistive technology is to empower an individual by providing them this opportunity to be independent, to access all of their environments. Okay, so next let's talk about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And this is a civil rights law that makes free and appropriate public education available to children with disabilities. And there are 6 principles to IDEA. The first one is zero reject, which means that it's the educator's responsibility to locate, identify, and provide services for students with disabilities. The second principle is protection and evaluation. So that means assessing to determine if a student qualifies for special education services. And the third is free and appropriate public education, which I'll go into in a bit, but that's developing and delivering an individualized education plan of special education services that confer meaningful education benefits. Number 4 is the least restrictive environment, where you educate students with disabilities and with their non-disabled peers in the most appropriate setting. Number 5 is procedural safeguards, which is complying with the procedural requirements of IDEA. And the 6th principle is parental participation, which is just collaborating with the parents when you're determining and developing the IPE. Whoops. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is free and appropriate public education. So FAPE is a civil rights law also stating that every individual, regardless of their ability, should not be excluded from education. And then next is least restrictive environment. This is when students with disabilities are educated with their non-disabled peers, giving them the same opportunities. And this pyramid that I have on the right shows the different stages of least restrictive environment. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we see the very least restrictive environment. That would be a full inclusion classroom. And then there's the middle, and then the most restrictive environment, which is like a full-time and a special day class. And response to intervention is a multi-tiered approach to early identification and support of students with special needs. So there's 3 tiers to RTI. The first one is where all students in the education system start off. So everybody's roughly at grade level and performing the same way. Tier 2 is when there are a few students that might lag a little bit behind their peers, and so they need some minimal to moderate intervention strategies to get them up to grade level. And tier 3 is when students are really far behind their peers by 1 or more years. And at this level, a child will require extensive amounts of intervention. And if a child's in tier 3, then they should be considered for special education services. Section 504 is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities, and that just gives a child their right to equal access of education. Okay, so let's talk about the program learning outcomes, or PLOs. And each one of these PLOs has been defined by the Assistive Technology and Human Services graduate program, and they've been extensively covered over the last 2 years of study. For this presentation, I'm going to be covering all of the PLOs except for number 4, which I am demonstrating my proficiency in, and number 5. So PLO 1, human and technological factors. So within a school setting, assistive technology really promotes response to intervention and least restrictive environment. The nature of AT really is based upon human interaction and not just an AT user reacting with their technology. It also involves the environment reacting to their technology, as well as other individuals that come in contact with them. So in general, the research that I found showed that teachers are really willing to implement assistive technology on a whole, but there are a lot of identified setbacks. So some of the identified setbacks are the attitudes towards AT and adoption, and that could look different for every student, but the big thing that you want to keep in mind is that any negative experience from any one person in a student's environment, 9 times out of 10 from my personal experience, you'll see device abandonment, because no one wants to look different, and if they have a negative experience with something, they might just disregard it and not want to use it anymore. So teacher attitudes and their peers' attitudes and family attitudes are really important for AT adoption. A teacher's education regarding AT is just as important. If they feel like they don't really know all that much about the assistive technology, they might be scared to implement it because they don't know any better or any of the implementation strategies, which is the last factor. But also it's important to note that lack of administrative support is also a problem for implementing assistive technology, especially in the case of response to intervention. If an administrator doesn't understand what assistive technology is, they may not see how it could help other students before they fail out and end up having to be enrolled in special education classes. They may only see it as a dollar thing, and if it's not formally recommended on a student's IEP, they just might not buy into it. So since schools are required by law to promote response to intervention, it's really important that everybody on the staff understands AT and why it's valuable. So the next PLO is AT through different contexts. So disability is viewed within 2 models. The first model is the medical model, which is seeing disability almost as an illness and something that needs to be treated. And the social model, which looks to intervene and adapt to surrounding environments and challenges that people with disabilities face. So it's looking at society and how that further disables the individual. So the school system, fortunately, sees disability through the lens of a social model, but there are a couple of cultural considerations that you have to consider when looking at assistive technology. So I'll go into that in a bit, but when we're specifically talking about FAPE and LRE outlined by IDEA, it's important to note that intrinsically those laws are only applicable to federally funded institutions, which means any student with a disability who might be enrolled in a privately funded school does not have the right to access not free and appropriate education, but they don't have this right given to them to get the accommodations. If they want accommodations for free, then they need to be enrolled in a public federally funded school. And some research that I found was by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, or USCCB, where they actually identified that roughly 7% of their 2.4 million students enrolled in Catholic schools actually meet the requirements of a disability outlined by IDEA. So all of those students, if they were enrolled in a public school, then they would have access to all of these accommodations that they might need. And this article by the USCCB really just kind of encouraged educators in these Catholic schools to provide accommodations for them, despite the fact that they're not legally obligated to. So I thought that that was pretty cool. So in terms of factors that might make an AT user reject their AT would be lack of understanding of the AT by their family or cultural rejection of AT. We see a lot in the research that there are a lot of cultures out there who unfortunately view disability as something sinful, and so they kind of just throw it under the rug and try not to address it. And so a lot of times these students might end up in situations where their parents actually just refuse services because it's not seen as culturally appropriate. So as an AT specialist, you have to understand how AT shapes an individual's culture and defined identity and the meaning that AT holds in that person and their family's culture. So our PLO3 is product design. And the main thing that I'm going to talk about is the universal design for learning. So there are 3 principles within the theoretical framework of UDL, and they're all multimodal. So it's supporting recognition learning through multiple modes of presentation, supporting strategic learning through multiple means of expression, and supporting effective learning through flexible modes of representation. And a really great example that I read in a study was a teacher who had completely modified her lesson plan, and it ended up being within the realms of UDL. She was looking out for a student, and she was practicing RTI for this student because she thought that they needed extra help. And she realized that this one particular student took notes better if he took them on his phone and he just typed into them. And so she thought about her lesson plan, and she decided that as a whole, she would allow everybody in the class to take notes on their phone. And so that student could take notes on his phone. And because of that, there was no barrier for any student, and he was able to equally access the curriculum, even though he might have down the line been recommended for special education services. At that time, she was able to use the theoretical framework of UDL to change her lesson plan and really make it accessible. So some identified barriers to acquisition are acquisition, selection, implementation, and integration. And you want to check to make sure that the AT device really meets these universal design principles, because if it fails to meet those principles, then you're going to run into the barriers that I identified. And when we're talking about response to intervention, it's really new, and there isn't that much like empirical research regarding response to intervention, but you can tell that the theoretical framework that goes with response to intervention is very similar to universal design. And so both of them can be used concurrently within the classroom to help all students, including those with disabilities. So the next PLO is multidisciplinary fields in AT. So as the AT specialist, there's like this really heavy responsibility placed on that person to educate all the members on the IEP team, in addition to a lot of the teachers, because we're really trying to practice that RTI. So it's important that other educators in the schools know what to look out for and possible intervention strategies. So the AT specialist has to make sure that everybody's comfortable with the AT that they're recommending, that everybody's trained on it, and that any barriers are within the student's environment are taken out. So they also have to provide examples of appropriate implementation strategies. And in a research study that I found by RESNA, they're showed to be a very difficult task of writing measurable IEP goals relating to assistive technology. And then they did this study and they supplied teachers with training on writing measurable assistive technology goals. And then after the training, they were able to write a lot of better goals. So you can just see that just by providing teachers with training, then they'll be able to get it a little bit better. So, and then just kind of like to tie it all in, I found a study that explicitly said that everybody, like teachers and IEP team members, are really important because an AT system requires the expertise of multiple disciplines. So that's really important. Our PLO 7 is professional ethics. And this kind of ties into the law a little bit, and I'll go more into detail in the next slide. But first, we're going to talk about the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA. And this intersects with IDEA, really to just keep children protected, their privacy protected. This sets up the idea that only parents can release their students' confidential information to other individuals. Only IEP team members are allowed to discuss a case with other IEP team members. They can't discuss a case with anybody else. However, an AT specialist can get feedback from other educators outside of the IEP team, provided they don't release any personal identifying information about a student. So accommodations can still be made to promote least restrictive environment. So, and one other thing I'd like to mention is that researchers can acquire student information in an ethical manner to use for their research. And that has implications for the AT specialists, because they can take a look at this research and know that it's valid because it's coming from real students. And then they can further decide if this research supports a possible intervention that they want to use. So our last PLO is relevant regulatory policies. And IDEA is definitely the most commonly referenced legislation. It creates an obligation for that free and appropriate education in a least restrictive environment. It really just provides the AT access that a student needs. And once again, we're really just driving home the idea that all children have this human right to access their education in a way that accommodates them or is modified for them. And by extension, all educators have to be updated with current law and policy and trends so that they can make sure that they're always giving their students the chance to have that appropriate education. So that kind of falls to the AT specialists to constantly know what's new so that they can tell these teachers and response to intervention can change as needed. So for my conclusion, when discussing school-age children, AT obviously plays a very important role in promoting least restrictive environment, free and appropriate education, and response to intervention. The AT specialist is tasked with a lot of things, but a big one is to make sure that there are no environmental barriers or educational barriers to students' setting. And all team members have to recognize that AT strategies are really important and that they can be very beneficial for a student, and that AT recommendations could strengthen access to education, and then AT bridges the gap when discussing a child's least restrictive environment. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm going to take the next minute or so to slowly flip through my reference slides in case you guys would like to get that information down, and thank you so much for watching.